22. On the cleansing of the soul. Conscious and intentional deviation from moral perfection does not always indicate the corruption of the human heart. There are situations in which such a deviation reveals the depth of devotion within a heart and the maturity of its resolve. Such is the spiritual compromise necessary in the fight against villains, carried out with a religiously intelligent legal consciousness. Spiritual compromise does not consist in the fact that a person discredits, divorces himself from, or rejects the idea of holiness and moral perfection, but that, in deciding to turn to force and accept the sword, and knowing that the sword is not the highest, holiest, or most perfect way, he still embraces it, by no means discrediting, divorcing himself from, or rejecting the idea of moral perfection and holiness. Spiritual compromise does not at all quash the voice of conscience, which in the soul calls for moral perfection. It does not distort or weaken it whatsoever. Moreover, it does not even temporarily silence it, for the voice of conscience is necessary for each and every person, but the ruler and the warrior more so than anyone else. This is precisely because the everyday business of their lives requires them to, as it were, put aside concern for their personal righteousness. The business of the ruler requires not only wisdom, fidelity, fairness, and a firm will, but also discretion, resourcefulness, and the ability to combat the enemies of the people. The business of the warrior requires not only loyalty, a sense of honor, control, and courage, but also the ability to kill, military cunning, and ruthlessness. The outcomes are bad if the ruler and the warrior do not have the negative properties they need, but things are much worse if the necessary positive qualities disappear in their souls. If the negative properties are idealized and come to dominate, if they begin to accept bad for good, cultivate only bad things, and make these the cornerstones of all their activities. A ruler or a warrior with a deafened or perverse conscience needs nobody, no cause, no people, no God. They are no longer a ruler but a tyrannous villain, no longer a warrior but a marauder and a bandit. Their salvation is in the voice of conscience. They must have a firm understanding of where, how, and why their activities depart from the covenants of righteousness, and allow this system of actions and establishment no more than necessity requires to combat the villains. The rulers should understand that if the state is reduced to spying on citizens and to intrigue, both of which feed the spirit of civil war, it will destroy itself along with the public morality, and will no longer fight evil but serve it. However, understanding this, they should abolish neither the secret police, nor diplomacy, nor counterintelligence, nor the state apparatus of suppression and war. Instead, it should be ensured that all of these functions are in the hands of honorable, conscientious, and religiously minded people. In the soul of the warrior must live the mighty, unapproachable limits separating the obligatory from the forbidden, and these limits cannot be supported by a single mechanical discipline. Here, spiritual autonomy is necessary, comprehending discipline with the beginnings of faith, loyalty, conscience, and honor, so that the warrior understands why he must kill the enemy in battle and the rebel during rebellion, why the private property of his family must remain untouched, why skillful counterintelligence in the enemy's camp is a manifestation of valor, while intrigue in the regiment and in public life are manifestations of baseness. In well-known, strictly defined relationships and cases, a man of force and the sword should be able to perform actions that are clearly divergent from his own ideal of holiness and perfection. He must have the strength to get past his internal disapproval, to keep his protest personal, to overcome the possible revulsion in himself and to do what is necessary. And further, he must not only do so because of discipline and orders, for he can always find himself in the position of being a catalyst in giving orders. He must therefore be capable of these actions based on a religious feeling and a spiritual conviction, to take responsibility for decisions and orders, to arrest, sentence, and shoot. But it is this energy of spiritual compromise that can and should awaken his conscience. Acting with the consciousness of spiritual necessity, he must not at the time of his actions weaken himself by reflecting on idealizations or indulging in premature remorse. He who walks the tightrope and begins to look down, untimely falls and is dashed on the rocks below. For a spiritual compromise, he must prepare himself beforehand. He must weigh up, consider, intuit, and decide, and at the moment of action he should feel himself already strengthened in his service, in his sense of responsibility and duty, and in the knowledge that he has established spiritual necessity as the measure of authority and order in their most extreme understanding. But beyond action, it is only natural and necessary to illuminate oneself with God's ray. It is both possible and necessary that apart from actions themselves, all the noblest forces of the human spirit within the actor should come into motion, into a state of heightened sensitivity and increased awareness. His attitude towards God, his conscientious adjudication, and his will to an unconditional righteousness. This does not make it necessary for him to condemn his actions committed during the period of struggle, but is required to strengthen his ability to make spiritual compromise. For spiritual compromise occurs when he does not shake the spiritual foundations of man, does not destroy the walls of his personal Kremlin, does not tear himself from God, does not drown his conscience. The deeper the religiosity of a person, the stronger in him the love and sense of spiritual dignity, the more free in him the breath of conscience, then the more he can afford spiritual compromise. The less harm he brings in his interactions with the villain, the less he hardens his negative love, the less he devastates his spiritual personality with acts of forced treachery and brutality. In so many words, the more accurately he finds the precise limits of the necessary compromise. These limits cannot be determined in advance by any abstract principles. They are instead found in the very process of struggle, and creatively so, regarding each case as unique, with the help of living discretion and extreme understanding. It is for this reason that the basic spiritual attitude of man is of such paramount importance, for he uses this as a reference point for any given situation, and with this he sees, understands, and decides. And this attitude is given to nobody at will, easily and simply, without preliminary, preparatory spiritual work. Authenticity, purity, and depth of goodwill are the foundational and most basic conditions without which a dutiful and victorious struggle against villains is impossible, and the acquisition of these commitments requires a constant, long-term, and arduous struggle over one's spiritual cleansing. A man in action never reaches the heights at which he truly lives up to the examination and inspection of his soul's actions. The question is solved not by the bogus appearances of his life, which are deceitful for others and, perhaps, for himself, but by the state of that passionate inner depth, the relation of which to the Spirit and to God determines the entire personality of man. The need for a heroic act, for danger, daring, and trouble, does not cause anything unprecedented in the human soul and cannot change either its qualities or its strength. It can only strictly take into account the actual and ruthlessly total up a man's patrimony, awakening what sleeps, revealing the invisible and demonstrating the innermost. Man's action is his revealed being. It is naive to neglect the fundamentals of one's spiritual being and then to think that at the moment of trial, actions will somehow themselves reach the heights. It is naive to conceal from oneself one's true reasons, motivations, inclinations, and passions, and imagine that what is imperceptible is powerless in the soul, and that our hidden passions do not spill into our actions, do not distort them in their essence, do not fill them with unexpected content, do not illuminate them with the glow of a lurking evil. No human act is accidental. Each is the ripened result of an entire life up to the present, the manifestation of a complete set of personal ways of being. And so each of us commits acts not only through a specific effort, the fact of carrying out an action, but by the entire process of our lives up to that point. If the soul of a man is pure, then his actions will be true, despite their apparent inconsistency with the laws of righteousness, and vice versa. Even the most righteous deeds of an unclean soul will be wrong, and if this applies to every person, then for the ruler and the warrior it holds a very special significance. According to the ancient and profound view rendered by the Orthodox Church, people who wield force and the sword do not possess them in the form of privileges, but in the form of religiously meaningful service. This service imposes on the person a special burden of accountability and a special burden of responsibility, and among these responsibilities, the carrying out of executions and warfare are grave indeed, and it is possible to cope with this burden of responsibility only with a constant concern for the religious purification of one's soul and one's will. It is impossible for man to live on earth and to do the work of God without accepting a spiritual compromise, but it is the spiritual compromise which requires a religious and moral purification. Spiritual compromise seeks and finds the most righteous among available unrighteous outcomes, but this outcome, the most righteous among the unrighteous, remains, of course, unrighteous, despite all its heroism, for all its religious significance and spiritual beauty. Through another's aggressive existence, evil takes a righteous person out of his spiritual balance, away from his moral pleroma, and leaves him no absolutely righteous outcomes. In this it would be possible to perceive the victory of evil, for its victory may consist either in the fact that the human soul becomes infected with its antipathy and anti-spirituality, or in the withdrawal of the human soul from spiritual balance and moral pleroma by the very process of response to an atrocity. A man who responds by force and the sword to the aggression of a villain cannot but leave the spiritual balance and moral pleroma, and in this evil there is always a kind of visible, inner, psychospiritual conquest, such that in this sense evil always succeeds, and then, when the weak-willed moralist enters the path of cowardly concealment and treacherous selfishness, while the strong, faithful person chooses the path of negative love and a just sword, he does so in order to deprive the villains of their psychological success only to conform to a consistent rejection of the world which borders on Buddhist self-annihilation and direct suicide, and it goes without saying that personal withdrawal from the perception of evil does not solve the very problem of evil in terms of its objective, global significance. This is why a true struggle against evil can and should be conducted precisely in combining spiritual compromise with religious/moral cleansing. It is the process of purification, following a feat which is unrighteousness, which takes away from evil the last semblance of victory and triumph. Religious and moral cleansing, repentance, coming from a deep revision of one's state and content, as well as a new introduction to the divine pleroma, are all necessary for the ruler and the warrior already because they are human beings and there is no man who will live and not sin. Everyone requires these things in general, including those who do not bear the burden of force and the sword, and those who, within the limits of their personal living patrimony, follow the path of generous deference, as foreseen in the gospel. To fight for the purity of one's goodwill and for the purity of one's conscious and unconscious motives. To this task each person is called, and this vocation on earth ends for him only at the time of his earthly death. But the ruler and the warrior must be purified in a special sense, and this difference is determined by their vocation, their struggle, and their responsibility. It is necessary for them before a direct struggle, during it, and after leaving it, both for themselves and for the continuation of the struggle. A soul resisting evil through force and the sword requires cleansing efforts already at the very perception of evil in order to free itself from possible disturbances of passions, temptations, confusion, unbalanced and premature explosions, any predilections, and all sorts of unwise psychological motions. It needs these things, and before the struggle begins, it must establish itself in spiritual love as the primary or even the only source of its resistance. That resistance should be fought out of devotion to the cause of God, out of patriotism, out of religious passion, and not out of greed, personal hatred, revenge, or other unintentional motives, so that even when the struggle is fought for themselves, for their property, or for their personal rights, men could be justified in this struggle, they would feel themselves participants in God's work and fight in the person of themselves for something more than themselves and their own concerns. A true and pure motive of struggle is the first guarantee of its dignity. The level at which it is conducted, the limits to which it reaches, and the success that it will achieve. However, in order to fight the villains, a person needs not only an objective source and a motive, but also a correct vision. Purifying work is necessary for one who resists evil, in order for him to correctly distinguish and see true evil, in order to correctly identify his goals, his duties, and his means, and, on his part, it is right to choose the necessary and valid measures of resistance. Selfless struggle against imaginary evil and imaginary villains is a quixotism, a tragicomic mix of grandeur and naive blindness, ultimately beneficial only to villains. Purification of the soul is no less necessary after exiting the struggle. Above all, this is required in order to neutralize and extinguish in oneself all sorts of traces of an imperceptibly penetrating contagion. All of these emotional fallouts, impressions, echoes of the ongoing struggle, beginning from the flare-up of bloodthirstiness, hatred, and spite, and ending with undefined surges of intrigue and deceit. All these remnants, not exposed with light and not rendered harmless, settle in the soul like tufts of an evil fog over gorges and crevices, and imperceptibly poisons the sentiments, will, and thoughts of a person. They have the ability to assimilate the spiritual atmosphere, and if this assimilation takes place, then they naturally merge with the person's own bad impulses, feed on them, strengthen them on their part, and greatly hinder the spirit in conducting an appropriate struggle with them. But most of all, the purification of the soul is necessary in order to save the soul from the possible hardness and bitterness associated with the perception of evil, with resistance to it, and with all kinds of compulsion and suppression. The crusader's soul must not lose its higher fortunes and potential in the struggle. It must constantly return and regain its capacity for spiritual balance, for the fullness of positive love, for the conscience of the pleroma, for the prayer that melts in the soul and focuses joy. For even the angels, of whom St. Ambrose writes, On the completion of their painful mission of wrath and collection of tribute, return to the contemplation of the face of God and again are part of His light. And finally, the same process of spiritual purification can and should give the soul of the crusader the reassurance and the strength that is necessary for his participation in a new struggle, new strains and feats. For the true purification of the soul does not relax it, but strengthens it. And if the man who wages battle with the sword cannot stand the appearance of his deeds and, shaken by the sight of fear, death, and blood, is exhausted and wearied, he must be sure that this paralysis can be overcome not by idealization of the perfect and by flight from conscience, nor by a faint-hearted renunciation of what was done, but instead by the path of a deep catharsis of the soul. For in the sacrament of repentance the chaos of passions is not only extinguished, but the Spirit is imparted to the appropriate power and strength. He who resists evil men with force and the sword must be purer and higher than his own struggle, otherwise he will neither lead it nor complete it with victory, but instead it will entice him, distort his appearance, and cast him down, broken, humiliated, and vicious. Only the one who owns himself, that is, his passions and his vision, can wield force and the sword, for if a man does not own himself, then the sword and force master him, and they will not be his tools and means, but he will become their tool and means. And then he will die by the sword not physically, but morally and spiritually. His energies will be squandered, his soul will be disfigured, and the fight lost. It follows, then, that the purification of the soul is the foundational condition of victory in the struggle against evil. The problem of spiritual compromise is resolved by the fact that the power of personal devotion to God's work and God's commandments, deepened and strengthened in the process of religious purification, overcomes all the temptations, dangers, difficulties, and prevarications that can damage the soul, and delivers it from the strain of struggle not weakened, but mighty and true. An active external struggle against villains is available to those who have nurtured and raised in themselves the power of the spiritual and, always in the final analysis, a religious nature, and this nurturing requires, above all, an effort to cleanse oneself. Weak, religiously groundless characters are incapable of bearing the burden of spiritual compromise, the burden of descending to the grave, violent and cunning means of struggle, and because they cannot master what they achieve, and cannot strengthen themselves in what they have mastered, they are as a weak, unfortified stronghold with a wavering and timid garrison. By comparison, the more a stronghold is reinforced and armed, the more dutiful and enthusiastic its defenders, the more challenging and perilous the missions which can be undertaken by its commander, and similarly, the more intense and hardy the religious character of a person, the less difficult and dangerous it is for him to leave the religious and moral pleroma to fight against villains. That is why the Tsar needs primarily a religious force. He requires not only the will to power, but also the power of devotion to God's work, which is to serve His people. Not only willpower, but also religious and societal purity. Not only the purity of will, but also the purity of vision. A Tsar with a cowardly, weak-willed, religiously indifferent, and lowly soul is a misfortune and a curse for his people, and the first duty of such a monarch is to realize his unprincipled nature and personal spiritual bankruptcy, and abdicate. Religious comprehension and sanctification of the Tsar's power and, further, of all state activities and services, conceals within itself an intrinsic, profound, and saving truth. And this is why we should take care not to separate the church from the state, religious purity from the ministry that engages in spiritual compromise, but to concern ourselves with their correct combination and cooperation. The same profundity and salvation is imbued with the idea of a Christ-loving army. A warrior is called Christ-loving not only because he is a member of a Christian state, that his homeland flourishes in the Christian spirit, and that he himself is called to defend the Christian faith, but also because in love for Christ and for the perfection he teaches, he finds a living basis for his personal spirit, one which claims the shrine of his personal Kremlin, and from which he draws the necessary strength for heroism and catharsis. There is here no inner contradiction, that which sentimental moralists try to see. On the contrary, the sword is spiritually necessary for man in the earthly struggle for the work of God, but the only people who can bear the burden of the mental and physical dangers and sufferings associated with it are those who affirm their love, their life, and their actions in the ray of God's light and perfection. And so, if we combine all the state's principles of compulsion and suppression in the image of the warrior, and the principles of religious purification, prayer, and righteousness in the image of the monk, then the solution to the problem will be expressed in the description of their mutual need for each other. The warrior as the bearer of the sword, and his world-embracing compromise necessitates a monk as a confessor, a source of living purity, religious wisdom, a moral pleroma. Here he receives grace in the sacrament and receives strength for his actions. Here he steels his conscience, confirms the purpose of his service, and cleanses his soul. And his sword itself becomes a fiery prayer. This is Dmitry Donskoy meeting Saint Sergius before the Kulikovo battle. The monk, as the living guardian of purity and righteousness, is attached through the warrior to the burden of the world, to his suffering and his heroic unrighteousness. He no longer dismisses and remains closed off in his righteousness. He protects and builds not for himself. He does not turn away from evil and malign circumstances, but enters into a struggle with them, becoming an ally of the warrior, sharing in his suffering, blessing, and understanding his heroic deeds, keeping for him purity and sagacity. The monk appears as a guardian angel of the warrior, and his very prayer is akin to a fiery sword. This is the holy Sergius, who blesses Dmitry Donskoy and gives him 2 mobile novices. The old Russian Orthodox tradition correctly and profoundly resolves the question of the relationship between church and state, in the division of their spheres and the organic harmonization of their goals and their efforts, in the mutual independence of their organization where they neither encroach or intervene in the legitimate sphere of the other, in the warrior's voluntary acceptance of the monk's spiritual wisdom, and in the monk's undemanding gift of necessary earthly fruits. With this solution, the warrior did not fall under the weight of his burden, and the monk did not turn away from the burden of peace. Resistance to evil was conceived and occurred as an active, organized service to the cause of God on earth, and the state's affairs were interpreted as being not outside of Christian love, but within it. And, perhaps one of the most majestic and touching customs of this system was the custom according to which the Orthodox monarch, sensing the approach of death, accepted the monastic vows as a final return from his unrighteous service to the pleroma of justifying purity. The need for spiritual and moral purification is directly foreshadowed and established in the gospel, and all the more for those who devote themselves to the fight against the evil of others and against other people's crimes. He who does not know how to remove the beam from his own eye, Matthew 7:3-5, Luke 6:41-42, will not be able to remove a mote from the eye of his brother, and all his adjudications thus become exercises in hypocrisy. Only a pure eye can truly see where there is weakness in another's soul, where there is an affliction and where there is evil, to discern and identify the sound judgment and the sure measure, Matthew 7:1-2, Luke 6:37-38, that judgment and that measure by which he himself would be happy to be judged and measured. But pure can only be that eye, the purity of which its owner always longs after, for no one is holy, only God is holy. He who judges must be himself ready to judge himself, and this means that he must always judge himself as he judges a villain. The measure of judicial competence is determined by the measure of self-cleansing. The villain does not judge the villain, and those dirtied by ardent weakness are not given to be stoned by feeble and passionate sinners. John 8:3-11. But first take the beam out of your own eye. Matthew 7:5, Luke 6:42, and then you will see. And then you'll see if you need a sword and where exactly you need it. And if it is necessary, you will find in yourself the strength to raise it against the villain and to put an end to his crimes. To let go of any fear, that of the sword returning upon your own head, that of leaving the moral pleroma, that of human judgment. For death is not terrible to he who goes to it for the love of God's work, and the temporary departure from righteousness is not terrible to he who leaves out of love for God, and the judgment of the blind and the cold is not terrible to he who judges himself by the ray of God, and who knows before all others where he has departed from humanity for love of the divine. It is not for any person to judge another for such love and for such a service. It is not for any man, but only for God. And before him, the faithful bearer of the sword will appear on the day of judgment with that confidence, 1 John 4:17, which is given by true love.